The more important a resources is to human survivability, the less acceptable it is to become an object of political disputes. That is why we are so proud to propose. But okay, firstly, several points to set up. Firstly, what is the nature of these critical resources? We think that it comes handy to three principles. A, it is essential. That means that almost, if not all necessities and living activity is dependent on these resources. But also B, it is geographically concentrated because the amount of critical resources are not abundant in anywhere, and only some places have the ability or have the capability to possess these kind of critical resources. So this makes the third principle. It is collectively binding because everyone will be impacted either of its abundance or its shortages, and this is what allows free trade and international economy of this global resources distribution. So this creates that no state can fully isolate itself from the global supply chains of these resources, right? So what is the problem in the status quo that this motion exposes? It comes to two things. First, not all countries have critical resources. This means that the free trade and international economy is become so important into the country's own necessities. That means in terms of critical times, in terms of war or even international disputes, it inherently harms the people because simply the people, the civilians, are going to be impacted directly when all of these shortages of these critical resources are simply happening. But also, secondly, it becomes a politicized access. It's politicizable in the context of, by the logic of national self-interest. That is, country A simply can politicize the access or restrict the access to country B of a some critical resources simply because they think that it affects their ideology or etc. etc. So just like WHO on healthcare, UNICEF on education, or ICC on international crimes, we need an international organization that is not self-interested in politics to actually maintain this stability of the global critical resource distribution. So our burden of proof, as the proposition side, is that not that this is a preference motion, dear panels. So our burden is comparative. We will show you two things through my arguments. A, why in any case that IMA resources management is actually better in rather than status quo, but also B, what kind of work that government defense actually is better on. So moving on to my first argument, why IMA? Why simply IMA? Contextualize their panels. Access to critical resources, especially in the relevant times, depends heavily on political and economical condition rather than human needs. So this means that, for example, you can see how the Russia embargoes the gas distribution across the countries of Europe, not simply because to make it unstable, but simply because there's like the ideological discourse, or there's simply because they can politicize the access of because of that conflict, right? Same goes with export restrictions or resources handling during crisis. This is what happens in Gaza nowadays. This is what happens in Iran, for example, when there's like these disputes, this current disputes with USA, right? So this is dangerous, dear panels. Why? Because it creates two things. A, it immediately impacts the civilians because once these resources are gone from the country, then those who cannot go, those who cannot sustain their living are the civilians. But also B, it escalates to geopolitical coercion because this means that any country that has any kinds of critical resources will become something that many other countries depending on. And this creates, like by the logic of national self-interest, they want to maximize their own profit. And this makes them to coercively use, or they coercively politicize the access to all of these critical resources. So how does IMA solve or avoid this harm? It comes to two things. A, it becomes IMA becomes a more stable organization that reduces unilateral control because IMA simply supervises this resources distribution and creates transparency of these distributions. In other words, IMA is simply supervising or controlling the coordination, not the ownership of these resources. But also B, it helps governments in decision making. Just like again, any UN organizations in any kinds of sectors, IMA can help decision making, especially in terms of critical times or sustainable plans, for these governments to actually rationally and justifiably think of what they should do in the next following years across these critical resources. So simply, IMA is guaranteed to be more or less self-interested politically rather than these countries. So, but preemptive, the panels. The opposition might say that IMA is not inherently natural and the government cannot actually presuppose or guarantee this. Well, we would say that yes, it is true that neutrality cannot be absolute, but our neutrality here is fairly comparative. See how countries tends to leverage tends to leverage these uh, disputes over critical resources, right? And IMA simply avoids that. So the best case of the side of the proposition is that we decreases coerciveness of how governments would apply policies to these critical resources, but also we able to ensure a stabilized or a more stable supply chain than what is happening in the status quo. Even if IMA is not perfectly neutral, dear panels, we still um, gain transparency and we still pressure against politicized unilateral control that otherwise can be hit by all of these countries simply by the logic of national self-interest or sovereignty. Now, opposition side of the house, their base case is simply the status quo. There is, as I have told you, is already very harmful, dear panels. It is already very critical. And the worst case that they can bring to us is that they create a good collapse of global cooperation because countries realistically will tend to maximize their own interests. They will tend to maximize their own development. And this creates a less trustworthy global cooperation on how these critical resources are going to be distributed across the countries. So the exclusivity in is the two things. Only proposition creates institutional incentives for cooperation, but only prop again separates the matter of resources to that of the geopolitical countries. And that's why government arguments should be blocked. Now, second argument, why IMA creates a better world. Now, contextualize their panels. Countries tend to maximize short-term extraction and geopolitical advantage because whoever controls the resources controls everything. It controls the power. It has the legitimacy to simply coercively do another things upon other countries. So this creates two massively degrading things. A, there's an over extraction of materials or resources simply because they think so. B, there's an environmental destruction. Why is this important, depends? Because environmental degradation on the status quo is already globalized. See how USA simply extracts oil from everywhere in the world simply because they are so lenient to it. Or maybe other countries that needs other kinds of export income so that when there's a high demand from other countries, they simply extract it from their own countries without proper management. So, but also secondly, this makes green transition unstable and inconsistent because states prioritize short-term profit rather than global stability. How does IMA solve this? Two things. A, there is this IMA ensures, as I have said to you before in the first argument, a coordinated supervision by supervising and monitoring all of the resources distribution. But also B, there's a shared international oversight because this means that countries are no longer act simply about sovereignty claims, but they also will have this consideration or moderate consideration about other countries. Why is this exclusive in our side? Because only prop then incentivizes sustainable coordinations over time, but also B, only proposition recognizes that environmental hard care is transnational and therefore the management is transnational. And this is why our proposition argument should be bound. Thank you.